work that you do.
Thanks.
Really appreciate it. So the next talk we have is Lawrence Gunther. And I've known Lawrence for a few years, and I'm happy to have him join the next session. So the next session is called The Changing World, and we're just talking about different aspects of aquatic systems that are changing and some of the interesting things people are working on related to that. And just as a little bit of a bio on Lawrence Gunther, he founded Bluefish Canada, which is a charity dedicated to water quality, fish health, and informing and inspiring the next generation of conservation-minded outdoor enthusiasts. And Lawrence is also the host of Bluefish Radio, which I've myself and other actually members of the River Institute, and I believe Steve Cook's also been on your show, and lots you interact with lots of different anglers and researchers, and just lots of different perspectives on aquatic systems. And I really enjoy listening to your radio show on that. You've also helped produce an award-winning documentary called What Lies Below, which is on CBC's documentary channel, and I encourage everyone to watch that. It's an amazing documentary and very inspiring. So we're really happy to have Lawrence here. Lawrence is also sort of well known as North America's only blind conservationist. He also does lots of writing and podcasting and blogging, and he's, as I mentioned, a filmmaker and a TV host. So just incredible suite of things that you're involved with, Lawrence, and we're really happy to have you today. So today, your presentation today, I won't take up much more time. You're going to be talking about the public consultation process that you've led on fish health in the Great Lakes. And I know you consulted with many stakeholders on that, so I'm really interested to learn more about that consultation process. So I'm going to bring up your presentation right now.
Thanks, Matt.
And we'll get that, and I'll advance that for you as well.
Let me know when you got the first slide up there.
Sure thing.
Okay. No, it's really nice. These symposiums the River Institute has been putting on now for 27 years. It's hard to believe, but I've been going to them for quite a number of years. I've been presenting, listening in the back row, enjoying the science days, the public days, and you know, sometimes even organize some events like Stephen Cook and I and Bruce Tufts and some other great thinkers, you know, on the area of fish health. Did a whole morning a few years back on just fish health, and that's what we want to talk about today is fish health.
All right, so your presentation's up here, Lawrence, so whenever you want to start.
So yeah, Bluefish Canada is our charity. We started that in 2012. It's across Canada. We really just focusing on engaging, inspiring, and informing the next generation of conservation-minded anglers, and encouraging all anglers to become citizen scientists, to fish ethically, whether they're catching and releasing or harvesting sustainably. Really, just taking the science of the researchers of like Stephen Cook and others and putting that into practice, right? I mean, that's where our role is just to take that knowledge, those best practices, that science, you know, run it by fishing organizations, bring in that local knowledge, blend it together and make some really good practices that everyone can get behind it. They're not laws, they're not rules. They go, quite often they go above and beyond the regulations, but they're just, you know, what makes an angler an ethical angler. And it's so important. So if we want to go to the next slide, fish health.
Okay, next slide.
No, okay. So it really, fish health can be the most trickiest to determine. I mean, you got to find fish. If you're sampling water, you're taking environmental samples, air samples, soil samples, you know, that stuff doesn't move around that much. Yeah, the air moves with the wind and, you know, there can be current in the water, but you can go back to the same place every day, every month, every year and take samples. You go back and look for fish, and Matt will tell you about that. You can go back and, you know, 5 years in a row, the fish are there, and the 6th year, they're gone. And then you got to go look for them again, and then you find them and they're different fish. It's a different species that's moved in, and you know the changes can be extraordinary just finding that. So engaging anglers and indigenous fishers in that process is so important. And yesterday I talked about the role of angler apps and the growing role of angler apps on smartphones to engage citizen scientists to help with research projects. And it's such an amazing examples we have across Canada of that happening now. Measuring fish health is you have to count the fish, count the size of the fish, count the number of the fish, examine the fish themselves. And we've got some great research going on. But again, you have to find the fish, right? You have to locate the fish. And that's not always a guarantee. I think about, the sturgeon on the Fraser River. We engaged citizen scientists to tag them and scan them and measure them every time they were caught. And it went really great. But then after a few years, people got a little bit fatigued. They stopped counting the small ones. Why bring in all the small ones and check them and measure them? And they're just small. They're 3 feet long. Let them go right away. So all of a sudden, a few years later, the report was saying, hey, there's no more small sturgeon. There's no more juvenile sturgeon. There's only big ones left. Well, it's because of fatigue. So it's not a guaranteed thing. You really have to maintain an engagement there. Fish stock sustainability is the key thing. And when you're dealing with fish health, there's all sorts of reasons why you want to keep those fish stocks, whether it's invasive native species or, the put and take fisheries like we have in the Great Lakes with the Pacific salmon that were introduced in there in the 1970s and have now become like native species, or common carp in the St. Lawrence River itself. that were put there over 100 years ago. The socioeconomic relevance, right? To people, the guides, the First Nations, Indigenous people, their culture, their tradition, their ceremonies, the sports, the activity, what you did with your grandparents and what you want to do with your grandchildren. Just in the Great Lakes itself, recreational fishing is an $8 billion annual economic contributor to the economy on both sides of the border. So that it's a huge thing. The freshwater commercial fishery in the Great Lakes is the most valuable commercial fishery in the world, right here on the Great Lakes. Next slide, consultations, please, Matt.
Okay.
I talked to stakeholders. The stakeholders we talked to, I wanted to say, what's your issues around fish health? What concerns you? We talked to Indigenous fishers. We talked to the angling community. We talked to the angling industry and the marine industry. We talked to scientists. We talked to policymakers. We talked to, as many people as we could to get those different viewpoints of why it's important. When you're talking an $8 billion industry, when you're talking to many, many First Nations communities, it's a lot of importance to a lot of people. What are their priorities? Is it about harvesting fish? Is it about making sure there's fish there? Is it about having a good put and take fishery? Is it about sustaining native species? What are their concerns in their forums? People are there's a lot of questions when you talk to stakeholders about how are the fish doing? We all got to understand that mercury has been a big issue, then PCBs, and now there's all these other forever chemicals. There's a lot of talk about raw sewage going into the water, but when you talk about all that unsightliness that happens when raw sewage goes into the water, it really, in the end, it counts as nutrients, and that really can stimulate a lot of good weed bed growth, and that could be helpful, especially now that we realize that the nutrients level in the Great Lakes and the offshore Great Lakes is dropping, and it's starting to impact the food base of our fisheries. So let's go to the next slide, water quality. Oh, I deal with a lot of water quality organizations and environmental groups, and water quality is a huge, huge issue. What's in our water? What's in our drinking water? How's that impacting the ecosystem? How's that impacting the environment? Lots of concern about water quality. We see this big push on removing and reducing nutrients flowing into the lakes because of blue-green algae, especially on Lake Erie. Well, Lake Erie seems to be doing quite well. It does have excessive nutrients and excessive blue-green algae. There's no doubt about it. But from an ecosystem perspective, it's quite healthy. The walleye fishery, the perch fishery there has never been better. Absolutely astonishingly amazing. The rest of the Great Lakes, the nutrients levels, are dropping off. And like I mentioned, the IJC just published a report saying fish health people and water quality scientists, we need to get together. We need to start looking at this as a holistic issue, not just how clean can we get the water, because really pure H2O, beautiful to drink, but it's just H2O. Nothing can live in it. You go up to some mountain lake that has, way above the tree line, that's frozen 8 months a year, and it's pure H2O, but you won't find anything living in it. So, is that what we want our lakes to be, is just gigantic glasses of pure drinking water? No, I mean, we want our water to be a little smelly. We want it to be alive. The water has to be alive if it's going to support life. So, I mean, the fish health impacts, the human health impacts of bad water quality and getting into the fish. I mean, how does that impact the fish itself? And, we hear a lot about the fish in the Athabasca River downstream from the oil sands projects there, and what that means to the fish, and you can't eat the fish. We talk about fish in the St. Lawrence River and the upper St. Lawrence River, and many concerns of the Mohawk people, some saying just don't eat it, it's just too contaminated, and others are saying, well, you got to eat a little bit just to keep our connection, because if we don't, I mean, that's 3 generations we'll have lost who have had to turn their back on the fish in the river because it's just not safe to eat. These are huge issues about our connection with nature, about our Indigenous people's connection with nature, all of our connections with nature. We've been eating fish since we crawled out of the oceans ourselves. I mean, look at the Bible, it's all fish, 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 right? It's many traditions, many cultures are connected to fish, and it connects us with nature. Next slide, fishing pressure. We're good? Catch and release came out in the 1980s as a very popular thing. Before that, like when I went fishing with my dad many years ago, we ate everything. Everyone ate everything. Fishing competitions was about bringing fish back dead, nailing them onto a piece of plywood and, measuring them. And that's what we did. Now, fishing competitions are for the vast majority are all catch and release. We started putting in these $1,000 plus aquariums built into our fishing boats, that have oxygenators and water recyclers and you name it, filtration systems. It's just, amazing aquarium equipment built into these fishing boats. And now we're even going beyond that, with angler apps, and we're going into catch, photograph, release right there. So the fish don't even get moved around. But we still want to harvest some fish. It can't just be catch and release. As some of our Indigenous people say, it's not even a good idea to play with our fish so much. And yeah, maybe sitting on top of a school of fish and catching 100 fish and as many as you can, there is going to be a mortality rate involved with that, and some people estimate it could even be 10%. So there's something to be said about harvesting fish, but which ones you harvest without impacting the health of the fish stock. The put and take thing is a great thing. I mean, we have that in the Great Lakes. Take all the salmon you want, and people should take more salmon. But if you're pregnant, or if you're a nursing mother, or if you're planning on having children, you can only eat 1 meal a month, maybe. We have all these advisories, so the value of the whole put and take fishery just declines, right? But we need to understand a put and take fishery is about you catch the fish and you put them back new, and then you can just keep that cycle going. But that's not the case with native species. You can't just harvest native species as much as you want and then have some hatchery somewhere put those native species back, because the chances of then putting back the right native species is very low. Next slide, fish consumption.
Okay.
Indigenous people, definitely, fish consumption is a huge aspect in two ways: ceremonies, celebrations, feeding their families, and like we see this now all the time popping up across Canada for years now, a moderate living, right? So it's a big issue for consumption and having access to food you caught yourself. We bought this year, like Steve said, so there's more people fishing this year than ever before. You look at the license sales of across Canada, absolutely amazing. And that continues. If that trend continues, we definitely need to monitor this more closely and find ways to manage fishing pressure. Recreational fishing, like I said, can be both catch and release and harvesting, but we need to figure that out, because if you compare that to commercial fishing, we monitor. We know how many fish are brought to the dock by a commercial fishing boat. We know when that commercial fishing season has to come to an end because it's reached its limit that scientists have established for that fishery, and to make sure that the stock is sustainable. We have no information about how many people are catching how many fish with their fishing license each and every year. We know how many licenses are sold in a province, but where those licenses are applied, on what bodies of water, and how effectively they were applied, and how many fish were actually harvested or caught and released and let go, we have no idea. Next slide, commercial.
Okay.
So advisories, how do we deal with these advisories? How do we make sure people are getting the right information? And how do we know that the chemicals being tested for, when they're the government is determining what fish are safe to eat and which ones aren't safe to eat, that they're testing for all the right chemicals? We know there's more and more chemicals being introduced into the environment all the time, like this PFAS, that they put in fire retardant and Scotchgard and many other products. It's a chemical that just doesn't go away, and it's highly toxic, and we know there's no safe limits of lead now that should be consumed in any stretch of the imagination. So where do you draw the line when you're measuring for these toxicities in fish to determine which are safe to eat? And what about the fish themselves? Like, we just published the Bluefish News last week on bluefishcanada.ca. If you want to follow that, we have a lot of subscribers for that news. And we looked at some Saskatchewan researchers that are doing fish tracking. And then we look at Lake Athabasca in the north, where all the uranium mines are. And a lot of these abandoned uranium mines are leaking radioactive waste into the ecosystem. And what does that mean for the fish that they're swimming in and out of those bays, past those tailings ponds, and then moving around and tracking all that radioactive contamination all across the ecosystem? Socioeconomic relevant. So that's the next slide, Matt. You good?
Yes, we're good. Yep.
All right. So moderate livelihood, we talked about that. It really is important for many levels for people to have a livelihood, and that's been so hard to measure. But Dr. Cook and his scientists have been making tremendous strides in this area. It's one thing when you have a big fishing company with their big fishing boats, you can see the economic value of that fishery. You can measure that pretty quick through the sales because the data is right there. It's easily accessible. But when you have hundreds of individual guides and hundreds of hotel and motel operators and fishing tackle shops and minnow salespeople and fishing lure manufacturers and other related, direct expenditures and indirect expenditures that go around measuring the economic and social value of a fishery, a non-commercial fishery, and First Nations people. I mean, what does that mean to have access to good, safe food that they catch right in their own backyards and have been for thousands of years? And then all of a sudden not having access to that food anymore, and then they have to turn to the grocery stores to supplement or replace that access. There's all sorts of socio and economic impacts and variables that need to be properly quantified and measured and understood and presented, because I think and the Cook Lab scientists have identified this, that once you measure this and once you have these numbers, you can present a pretty compelling case to politicians that something needs to be done better or differently. So recreational, commercial, and last, the connection to nature, right? I mean, how important is it to introduce children to nature, and how often do we do it at the shoreline? With that cornucopia of life that happens at the shoreline where terrestrial and water meet, and you see this microcosm of amazing life forms that children just love. There's a lot of psychiatrists now that believe that children deprived of that shoreside experience are deprived an essential part of their development, that came about because kids have always done that. And all of a sudden, if you stop them, you stop that accessibility, you stop that experience, now all of a sudden they've missed an important part of their human evolution, their human development. And what does that mean? Connections with nature is so important. If we're going to save nature, if we're going to save the environment, we're going to love it, we need to be connected to it. We need to feel good about it. We need to understand it. And that's not always the case if you live in a city. And last slide, thank you. Any questions? How's my time, Matt? Did I get it in the time?
You're great. You're perfect. Thanks, Lawrence. Yeah.
Good.
Really enjoyed that talk. Thank you. We have time for one or two questions. I just really, such a broad topic, right? Fish health and all these different stakeholders that you've you need to consult on that whole topic and issue. What's your sense on, having talked to so many different people through Bluefish Radio, and what's your sense on people's perception of fish health in the Great Lakes? Is it improving? Is it declining?
It's not understood well at all. We understand commercial fisheries and the value of commercial fisheries, but that's a beast in itself, and that they have their own scientists and they manage that quite effectively, and it's been going on quite effectively for over 100 years. But when it comes to fish advisories and valuing the socioeconomic value of recreational fishing, sport fishing, indigenous fisheries, we don't have a good understanding. We have some very general estimations, but I think the big problem there, though, and this came clear, is that you have environmental groups that really push on water quality, and not all of them are happy about hook and line fishing, right? And maybe for indigenous fishers, they're more sympathetic towards that, but for everybody else, less so. And I'm not talking everybody, but there are some very vocal groups that are just against that fishing. So that doesn't help. And then you have some other representatives in the sport fishing industry who don't look kindly on environmental groups that are constantly trying to shut down, or they feel they're always trying to shut down their sport, their way of life, their activity, what's important to them. So there's a little bit of mistrust going on between those extreme ends of those two sides of the equation. I think, though, and Bluefish Canada, our charity, and the podcast have shown that there's a lot more people, like what we call the silent majority of people, who just say, hey, I want to do this. I grew up doing this. I want to do this with my children, my grandchildren, but I want to make sure I'm teaching them the right way, because I still think it's a good, healthy, positive thing to do in the environment. It's a low cost, low impact thing to do in the environment, and I just want to make sure I'm teaching it to them the right way. And but I don't want to be discouraged, and I don't want to fight.
That's very true, right? So you have to inspire people without, being condescending or lecturing them about things, right? And I think you do a great job at that, just through all the education you do. So thank you so much for that presentation. And again, look forward. Encourage everyone listening to visit Bluefish Radio and keep track of all the interesting topics that Lawrence covers on that radio show. So thank you very much, Lawrence.
Thanks, Matt. Keep up the great work yourself, sir.
All right, thanks.